Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. George Nicholas to the stage. George, welcome.
When I started my career in archaeology, heritage was largely about things. The artifacts, the archaeological sites, the physical traces of ancient people's lives. Those objects provided a pathway to the past. For me, that view began to change almost 25 years ago through an encounter I had with a middle-aged First Nations woman who was taking an archaeology course I was teaching in Kamloops at the time. And one day she came to me and she said, "I can't finish my term paper." And I asked her why, mentally reviewing the list of usual student excuses. And she said, "I can't finish my paper because my spirit helper left me." And my immediate reaction, to be honest, was, well, that's one I haven't heard before. And a split second later, that lightning bolt of deep understanding hit me, and I realized that despite what we had in common, the shared language, we were both wearing Levi's and all of that we had fundamentally different worldviews. And that was a profound moment for me. Today, I'm still an archaeologist, excavating sites, analyzing artifacts, using the tools of science to tease apart the lives of people 5,000, 10,000 years ago. But my view of heritage, my view of archaeology has been substantially broadened by having worked with and working with Indigenous peoples throughout Canada and the rest of the world. And what I've learned from them, what they've helped me to realize, that what's important about heritage is not the objects, not the places, but the values that they convey or are embedded in them. So this is a story not just of personal enlightenment, but I'm speaking also of issues that are continuing to unfold worldwide concerning Indigenous rights and needs. The distinction between Western and Indigenous ways of knowing are substantial, as this conference and others are exploring. And these differences figure prominently in heritage issues. And the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples have been substantial due to colonialism and other historic factors. The loss of land, the loss of language, the loss of sovereignty, and the loss of control over one's own heritage, what should be a basic human right. Certainly people in the West strongly support heritage. And they do so through heritage management legislation and policies, through support of museums that preserve and protect local through national histories, through educational programs and multiculturalism and much, much more. But there's more to it than that, because the public at large is fascinated with old things, from the very earliest vestiges of humanity millions of years ago, up through the more recent and historic periods. And we only have to look at the attention that the discovery of the lost ships of the Franklin expedition have had for the Canadian public to see an example of this. It took everyone by surprise except for the Inuit, who've always known where they were. But there's also a huge rift between Western and non-Western ways of knowing the world and of caring for what it contains. Not only do Indigenous peoples have little control over their own heritage, over their own affairs, but their ways of life, their traditional knowledge, have generally been viewed as public domain, free for the taking. Examples of exploitation and appropriation and commodification are rampant. And we don't have to look very far to find examples of artifacts and artwork and important places that are transformed into cheap souvenirs or valuable commodities or clothing fashions and on and on and on. Often used in ways very different from their original purposes and far from their point of origin. Traditional knowledge has been used by academics, by artists, by musicians and others, by biotech and pharmaceutical companies. And the list goes on. And generally, this is done without permission and generally with little or no benefits flowing back to the source communities. Human skeletal remains and DNA have become strong points of contention. The result is that real cultural, spiritual, and economic harm occurs to real people. All of us have a responsibility to be respectful of others. And most of us want to do so even though we may not always know the right way to do that, especially relating to heritage values and cultural needs. It's demeaning to always put broad scientific values ahead of those of the people whose ancestors created the archaeological sites or the historic places or whatever that we study today or that we visit as tourists. Here we need to remember something really, really important, that those sites, those places, those objects are their cultural patrimony, and the traditional knowledge is their intellectual property. So what do people need to know about Indigenous heritage values that will let us consider heritage in a more informed and respectful way? Let me share with you 6 things that I've learned. And the first is that heritage is not just about things, that material culture, artifacts, or whatever are important touchstones of history, whether a group's history or a personal history. And they reveal much about life and times and whatever of the past. However, no artifact, no archaeological site, no historic place, regardless of how old or how rare they may be, have any value at all without the meanings that we, whether as archaeologists, community members, or you, the public, that you ascribe to them, that we ascribe to those things. Second, heritage isn't limited to the past. For some Indigenous peoples, there is no division between culture and nature, between the natural and supernatural realms. Past and present may fold into each other. And what this means is that ancestral beings and supernatural forces may be part of this existence, not some other dimension. Witness my student spirit helper, or in this case, a young Moriori girl in the Chatham Islands of New Zealand standing next to a carved tree that is her living ancestor. That is, that ancestor is there right now. Third, heritage permeates the fabric of Indigenous societies. Heritage as a concept really doesn't exist in the familiar way in many Indigenous societies because what it represents is entwined with all other facets of people's lives. So the loss of a heritage place is not just an historical loss, but can threaten an individual or a community's well-being and way of life. One Chequameck elder once told me that the destruction of a large traditional food gathering place was not just the loss of being able to pick berries or harvest balsam root or whatever, but it severed her ties to her family history and a much larger and longer history. And she said she felt as if her arm had been cut off. Fourth, heritage is largely intangible. It reflects a society's engagement with the world, certainly as reflected through its material culture, the tools, the technology, the settlement patterns, and so on. But it's also the collective knowledge, the traditions, the wisdom, the origin stories, and so on, that envelop, that direct, that shape the material aspects of people's lives. Heritage research may have unintended consequences. Research on archaeological materials, including ancient DNA, can yield phenomenal insights into people's lives in the past. We can know with astounding detail the life history of an individual who lived 5,000 years ago, his diseases, where he got his tool materials from, where he traveled to and from. And many indigenous peoples want to have that kind of information to complement, to supplement their oral histories and so on. But we also have to realize that sometimes that information can have unintended consequences. It can end up threatening an individual or community's origin beliefs, or complicate land claims when ancient DNA or other evidence reveals that this group that's always been here is, from a scientific perspective, coming from somewhere else at some point in the past. And finally, heritage needs to be managed by heritage holders. All peoples have to have access to and be able to make decisions about their own heritage in whatever form that heritage takes. How can an outsider make decisions about someone else's heritage when they may not understand local values, local needs, or the consequences of certain kinds of decisions? None of this is rocket science. And I think it is common sense to all the community members. But it's not common knowledge to the majority of academic researchers and policymakers and the public at large, for whom indigenous ways of life are a ready source of research subjects, of art and inspiration, and many other purposes like that. Many of those folks are unable or unwilling to give up control over heritage management, or are skeptical about the legitimacy of traditional knowledge and indigenous ways of life, and indigenous ways of knowledge, and see traditional knowledge that is really there, that they can benefit from when it fits with what they already think they know about the world. But what if we turn things around? What happens when approaching heritage issues is informed by those 6 observations I gave you a moment ago? Some really interesting things occur when the community is in the driver's seat. And I've had the opportunity to see this happen firsthand through my involvement with the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project, which is an international research initiative that is, amongst other things, funding a series of community-based projects around the world, in which the community has complete control over identifying the community needs, of identifying the appropriate approaches that can and do include so-called scientific approaches, as well as other forms of traditional knowledge gathering. And I want to very briefly share with you 3 of these projects. The first is with the Moriori of New Zealand. And their project entails systematically mapping all of the archaeological sites and other important heritage places on their land, including the sacred groves of Kopi, the living ancestor trees. Now, some of those trees are diseased. Some of those trees are decaying. And what the Moriori are doing, because this is important to them, is that they are laser scanning those trees to capture this information, these images that are so important to them. And this information, all of this mapping information, is also being fed into a cultural database that they have developed. And and this is being done to help them make informed land use decisions about their own heritage, their own land, and so on. And an important consequence of how they've set about doing this is that the project has reunited elders and youth, because youth have been involved in the elder interviews and the filming and the field work. So this has been really, really important to them. The second example is with the Saginaw Chippewa tribe of Michigan. And tribal members have been using a large bedrock outcrop that is covered with what archaeologists call petroglyphs. These are rock carvings, or what the tribal members call teachings. And they've been using these for ceremonies. This is part of what's known as Sanilac Petroglyph Park today. And it's owned by an archaeological society. It is managed by the state of Michigan as a park. And the tribe does not have a key to the large gate that surrounds it. So for the Saginaw Chippewa project, This is helping them to develop a heritage management plan that gives them a say in what happens to this particular place that is so important to them. And it gets them to the point where they don't have to ask permission to access their own heritage. And my third example concerns the Inuvialuit of the Western Arctic. And this is a project about repatriation. About 150 years ago, a Hudson Bay Company employee who was working in the villages had amassed a large collection of tools and parkas and mucklucks and all sorts of objects that are now in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is a project about repatriation, but not the return of these objects, not the physical return of them, but the information that they contain. And so several years ago, a group from Inuvialuit, including elders and youth and filmmakers and scholars and associated academics, traveled to Washington, spent a week carefully examining and recording the old-style parkas and mucklucks and so on, so that that information is now available back in the community. Some of the old-style mucklucks have been reintroduced, and they have a wonderful website where they are sharing all of this information, not only with community members, but the broader public. What projects like these demonstrate, and there's many, many others, what they demonstrate is that when the community is in the driver's seat, local needs are met, new knowledge is gained, and old knowledge is strengthened and used in new ways. And by acknowledging that all peoples have the right to make decisions about their own heritage, we can be respectful of them and be enriched by what they may so willingly share with us. Because ultimately, heritage is not about things. It's about relationships and what those things mean to people. Thank you.
Masi Cho, Dr. George Nicholas, Masi Cho, thank you. Completely inspiring. You are a true ally to the Indigenous people. Masi, thank you.